I'll introduce you properly in a minute, but welcome to the SME revised look of the SME Growth Podcast. Those of you who are watching this will see that we've spent a bit of time, put a bit of effort into making the room look a little different.
It's looking good, it's looking fresh.
It is looking quite fresh. It's whether I should confess at this point, this is actually the second time Lisa's seen it.
It is.
We did have a little, given that we're going to talk about stress, we did have a little bit of a hiccup with the last recording. It was actually, ironically, a little bit stressful. But, we'd had the techniques and the training now to cope with it.
Got through it.
We got through it. So we are re-recording this, but I think it was great first time round, so hopefully it's going to be even better.
Even better this time. We've had a practice run.
So, right, should we have a go?
Let's go for it.
Let's go for it. Okay, welcome to the SME Growth Podcast. I'm Richard Buckle, and David Parry is not actually with us this week as he's away on holiday. So for those of you tuning in to listen to Dave, you can turn off right now. Or you can carry on listening to myself. And today I've got a guest with me, Lisa Gunn, who is a mental health professional and psychotherapist.
Yes.
What does that mean?
What does that mean? So that means that I am a therapist and I deliver cognitive behavioural therapy for people with anxiety and depression.
Wow. And that's not exactly why you're here to speak to me today.
It isn't, no. So a lot of my role also involves working with corporate clients and helping them to manage how to prevent themselves from getting unwell in the first place. So it feeds quite nicely into our theme.
Yeah. So we thought, well, one of the issues that we see a lot with our clients and with business owners and, just, I guess, in society in general is how people deal with stress. It's a big topic for business owners and for many people working in businesses nowadays. It's it's one of those kind of, I suppose, cultural phenomenons that seems to be increasingly in the news. And it also happens to be that April is Stress Awareness Month.
That's
Have I got
right.
that right?
That's right.
So we
Great
thought,
timing.
What better way to, we're almost at the end of April, but we thought we could sneak in there and get Lisa in. So I suppose one of the things that can be stressful, growing a business, being part of that kind of, top team in a business or even just working in a business can be stressful. And I was looking up some stats and it was actually I'm going to be honest, it was a bit disturbing, actually.
It is, isn't it?
The problem was bigger than I thought. Something like 56% of people who own a business or own an SME business feel like they need help with their mental health.
Yeah, so it's quite a large stat, more than half. And I think I saw another one, 79% find running a business really stressful and actually want to quit. So 1 in 5 feel like they want to quit on a daily basis. Which is huge.
It's far bigger than actually I thought, and I think maybe we touched on this when we've spoken before about is a bit of a gender thing in there, because like from the blokes particularly, I mean, I'm speaking as a bloke, something like you don't talk about it. You don't want to, you just carry on and, so that's kind of, I guess, some of the stuff we want to explore today to say, well, what's the, what is stress and
how do we talk
about it and all that type of thing.
Yeah.
But I thought I could probably, set the scene with a personal experience.
Absolutely.
With me. Mm-hmm. And I know we've had discussions before where Lisa has tried to analyse me.
We did. Still so much more to cover.
So we'll try and, not go down that path today. But yeah, so I was like probably, I don't know, maybe 10, maybe a bit longer than that, 15, 16 years ago in previous role before, I was doing this thing. And I was working in a business and I was really, really stressed. And it was one of those things that kind of crept up on me over time. People that probably know me today maybe wouldn't recognize this. I kind of, it's definitely tempered my attitude towards stress. There's a part of me that's very much like, just go and read, about Shackleton in endurance and just kind of crack on with it. But also I think having had this experience that I'll share that kind of, it's definitely changed my mind on some of these things. So, so I was, 15, 16 years ago, working in a business, was probably mid to late 20s, and started working on some projects, and it just the way the projects were structured and the way that, you know, things kind of happened meant that I ended up being like quite, you know, stressed about it. And it started to manifest itself, I suppose, just going home, just having a rant. You know, my wife Saffron, she would always be like, every single day you're coming home, you're ranting, you're kind of, you know, I had to get that out to somebody. After a while, like, I think it actually got to the point with her that it would actually bring her to tears to hear me talking about work the way that it was. And so that then meant that I kind of shut that off. And I think maybe that's something that other business owners actually could relate to. Like, there's only so much maybe that your partner wants to hear about, you know, how bad it's all going. So that, but then it started to manifest itself, you know, physically. So I was being, you know, sick at work, physically sick, in the toilets. There was actually, you know, someone there who probably wasn't the most helpful, who would kind of, you know, I had this whole thing that, you know, it was all the responsibility landed on me. So if it went wrong, I was going to be the one that eventually went to prison. Now, that was so far removed from the reality of the situation, but in my head, I'd convinced myself of this. And this particular person would always throw that in. Well, you know, you'd be the one that went to prison if this went wrong, and all this kind of stuff. So had all of this. And eventually a colleague of mine said, you look really ill. You need to go to see the doctor. So, you know, you kind of resist it and resist it and resist it. Eventually you go. And I went, and my blood pressure was like 185 over 130 or something like that, which apparently is high. I don't really know. Like, they're like, yeah, that's high. So she took my blood pressure a couple of times just to confirm it was right, and, you know, it wasn't a dodgy blood pressure monitor. So yeah, that was the blood pressure, and then she did an ECG because she wanted to make sure that I hadn't actually had a mild heart attack. So this was all when I was about, I don't know, 27 or something like that.
Still really young.
So quite young. But, you know, that experience has kind of, I guess, made me sort of take probably a slightly different view of the severity of mental health, actually. And at the time, even looking back on it, like, you know, 15 years ago, we just didn't talk about this stuff.
No, and it definitely wasn't talked about as much as it is now. And I still think there's a lot of work to do in that space. We're talking about mental health at work, and stress and how that manifests in mental health problems.
So, and I guess that's partly why we want to do this podcast, really, is to try and, you know, just open it up a little bit and just see where we go. So are you able to tell us what is stress?
Yeah, I think it's a good place to start, really. And I think one of the good things about talking about stress is that it's really common to everybody. So all of us experience stress, and I guess in the mental health field, we call them stressors. So they could be personal, they could be work-related. So if you think about it, all of us have an autonomic nervous system, so our fight and flight, people might be familiar with that. And it's a good system. So stress is good for us in a way. It tells us when there's a potential threat going on, and it alerts the body, and the body gets ready to fight or flight or freeze, friend, flop, or other kind of reactions we can have as well. So when we have any kind of threat, whether that's perceived or whether it's real, that can be work-related stresses, could be personal stresses, the stress alert will go off. Healthy, that's good, but it should return to its baseline. That's when we know we're doing okay. The problem is with stress is what we call chronic stress, is when that alert system is continuous and it's not having that time or that space to come back down again. So therefore the body's producing adrenaline and cortisol is a hormone that's corruptive over time. It's going to cause mental health problems, it's going to cause physical health problems as well. But really important, I think, and when I do my presentations to corporate clients, is what happens to the brain in those situations. So if I just kind of like simplify this, the brain's got an emotional center, the amygdala, and it's got a cognitive center with all of your problem solving, decision making, perspective taking, all the things that you need to operate well in business. Yeah. That's your cortex. Now, when you're stressed, the amygdala, the emotional center, is the most active part of the brain because it's like alert, what have we got to do to keep you safe? That means the cortex is the least active part. So therefore, for you to be able to operate and fire on all cylinders, it's not going to happen. So when managers or employers don't allow that space for people to manage the stress or maybe make workplace adjustments, which we'll come on to later, they're demanding the employers to perform at a level that they can't do. Their brain has got the capacity to do that. So it's really important to be able to manage stress well and manage that alert system that's going off.
Is there a positive case for stress as well?
Absolutely. I think stress is really good. It's actually a motivator. There's almost like you might have been in jobs before, I'm not sure if you have, where you're not stimulated enough, and that can cause stress. I don't know, if somebody's just sat there and there's not enough work to do, that can be really stressful. So stress is a good driver, a good motivator, and there's almost like a bit of a sweet point where you function really well and you've got enough drive. But then if you go over that, that's what gets into chronic levels.
And is that where we're almost looking at, so I can imagine situations where you say, well, I've really, we've got a big project, or we've got something we've got to get over the line, and that's going to, that's not going to fit into a 9 to 5, which will be a common experience to many of our listeners. But like, if that's for a 3-month period, say, that's okay, I guess. But if it's going to carry on, like, is there something where it's the end in sight bit of stress is okay?
I think so. So the brain kind of needs to know that a break's coming. So that really helps us to operate better. And I think we've spoken previously about how sort of back in the day, factory workers, they would work, they knew a tea break was coming, they'd work again, they knew lunch break was coming. So there was almost like this sense of the brain knew we're going to work now, then we're going to stop. And if you think about how we work now, and I think particularly post-pandemic as well, with people working hybrid, working from home, people didn't plan the breaks. And I'm guilty of this myself. I'll put call after call, and then 3 hours have gone by, I haven't eaten, haven't been to the bathroom. There's all this kind of like back-to-back mentality. There's not this kind of break coming, and that can be very stressful.
Yeah, I guess we find that. I guess we've kind of moved on quite quickly back to face-to-face meetings. Obviously, we're still using Zoom, Teams, things like that. But it was funny. I remember the first time, like post-pandemic, we actually had an actual face-to-face meeting. Obviously, 2 meters and masked up and all that, whatever. Yeah. But the bit that got me was, I think at the end of the meeting, you almost have that kind of, when you're face to face in the lobby, that bit of chat about just, shooting the breeze, what's going on. And oftentimes that's when the biggest part of the relationships are formed, because you've just got that little bit of like, it's not full on kind of problem solving, or, you're not on sort of show, as it were. Yeah, you're just sort of shooting the breeze. So, well, we found, I suppose, with when you're in the thick of it in the pandemic, working from home on Zoom calls, it was just like call, and it was very kind of clinical, that cutoff, wasn't it? It was sort of very different style of working.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And there was such a thing they called Zoom fatigue. So having your video on all day long and having to kind of look the part for work was exhausting people as well. So there's lots of different things that came out of that we wouldn't really have known about before.
Yeah. So if we've got that definition of stress in there, understand a bit more about, what stress is, and can be negative and also can be positive. It's about managing kind of your exposure to it, I suppose.
Yeah, how you manage it.
For SME business owners, people working, within SMEs, there's different causes of stress. Yeah. I would say cash flow is probably the primary one that we see, but there are others.
Yeah, so I think with, particularly if you're a business owner as well, is time management's a big thing. So I think I read a stat that about 35% of their work is admin. And if you think about how long admin tasks can take, if you haven't got the right staff in place, or maybe people are off sick, that can cause another stressor. And there's also, you might have heard this word, I think we spoke a little earlier about this, is imposter syndrome. When people are starting their own business or running a business, 1, it's all on them. 2, they can have this kind of undercurrent of almost like a crisis of self-esteem of, am I good enough? Are people going to think that I'm a bit of a fraud? Or what if people think that I can't do this?
Fake it till you make it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that can be a real barrier as well for people stepping out in confidence and doing things that they want to do. So there's lots of different things that are going on internally, but there's the external pressures, like you say, cash flow, time management, being able to switch off and saying, right, my day is done now. Often SME owners and business owners will carry on because, it's on my head. I've got to finish these tasks.
And it's not just the work side of things, is it? It's the... I think for a lot of business owners, work and life, home life as well, personal, professional, all ends up blurring into one big bucket of, I think last time we spoke, you had a word for that.
We call it the stress bucket.
Stress bucket. Tell us about the stress bucket.
Yeah, the stress bucket. So if you imagine, and just exactly what you said, you have the personal stresses, you've got work-related stresses, so you've got all of the stresses of your business flowing into the bucket. Then you've got you might have things like, conflict with the wife, or needing to kind of make a time for that relationship.
That never happens.
You've got other friendships that you might need to maintain, children. You've got other pressures. Maybe there's bereavement, maybe a moving house, all kind of things that can cause a lot of stresses in your personal life. And if you haven't got a sort of a valve to release that stress, that bucket's going to overflow. And that's where it manifests in things like mental health problems and some of the physical problems that you mentioned as well when you were in your late 20s. So one of the key things that we say, it's really important that you have like a valve that you can just hit on the side of that bucket to release that stress. And that comes out in helpful coping mechanisms. Sometimes we go for unhelpful coping mechanisms, such as let's have a glass of wine every night, let's just have junk food tonight, let's sit on the sofa and do Netflix and not go to the gym and not meet with our friends. Those things in the short term give you pleasure. Yeah, I'm going to get that buzz from the fat, sugar, salt. I'm going to get the buzz from just sitting here and relaxing. But over time, if we continue in those habits, they don't build our resilience. Whereas actually having healthier habits, things like making sure we're eating well, the brain-gut connection is huge. That's really important. Making sure that we exercise, that we have good connections with people.
Yeah, I was looking at that a while ago, that whole connection with the gut and the brain, and just, diet and gut health and
yeah, if we eat fruit and vegetables, that produces neurotransmitters in the brain. So actually it's kind of like our good mood is produced in the gut, manifested in the brain, if that makes sense. If we're not eating good fruit, good vegetables, all of those good things, we're not having that brain-gut connection. I think the stat I know is we're 60% more likely to get depressed if we're eating a high diet of processed food.
Wow.
60%, that's a lot.
That is incredible, actually.
Big beige diet is going to impact your mood.
Okay. So we need to be, providing people with fruit in the office.
That yeah. What a good call. Yeah.
That's what you're saying.
I'll tell them on my way out.
Yeah. So there's those kind of things like, we talked a bit before about sleep as well, and, how that impacts the kind of, stress.
Definitely. Sleep is a huge thing. So I think just moving on to what kind of ways in which stress manifests itself. Yeah. So having poor sleep is a big one. It can impact your relationship, snappy irritability, like you said, you offloaded a saffron and caused the emotional reaction. Being sedentary, disengaged from pleasurable activities is a big one as well. Alcohol, poor diet. But sleep is quite fundamental, really. So that's our way that we restore ourselves. And a lot of people don't sleep because they're stressed or they're having the what if anxious thoughts. It's on me. What if this happens? What if that happens? As soon as your body's in that stress zone again, it's elevating towards fight or flight. It's not in the optimum space for sleep. You need to have your body completely calm for sleep. Yeah. So that's where people struggle with getting into their sleep routines.
And if you are struggling with sleep, so, what is the best thing to do there? So, you're all guilty of, I'm really kind of, thinking I need to move my phone away from the bed at the moment, because it's just too easy just to, middle of the night, just, or just before you go to sleep, looking at your phone, that type of thing.
Yeah. Not healthy at all to do that. Yeah. No. So quite a good few pointers, I would say, is having your room nice and cool. Okay. Your body drops 2 degrees when you're sleeping. So trying to, again, create the environment the same environment that your body is in when it's sleeping. Having your room really dark is a good one. If you are getting up in the night, and I would say the rule of 15, so if you haven't fallen back to sleep again after 15 minutes, get up out of bed, which can be hard when you're all cozy and tired, but if you're not sleeping, the analogy I use is you don't sit at your dining room table and wait to get hungry. So don't lie in bed and wait to get tired. If you're not tired, you want to strengthen that association with your brain, between bed equals sleep. So if you're not sleeping in your bed, get up, dimly lit room, really boring book until you start to get that tiredness. And the brain learns, this is where we go to sleep alone. Yeah.
So if that's things you can do at home, so like looking at diet, looking at exercise, sleep, that type of thing, in the workplace, what, if you've got staff or, you've got employees, what do you, how can we help create a less stressful environment?
Yeah, well, there was a really interesting stat I saw earlier as well, that 63% of employers deprioritize their mental health for financial gain. So making sure that their business comes first, but they're not actually prioritizing their mental health. So lots of things that we can do in the workplace. I think the way that we work might need to change. That could be causing or contributing to stress. And I think also employers as well, the Equality Act 2010 states that if an employee has mental health problems, which can come on the back of stress, as stress, out of stress comes illness, they do have a legal obligation to make reasonable workplace adjustments. So it could be things like people starting later if they're not sleeping well. It could be having more breaks in the day. It could be anything that would be quite a short-term, wouldn't be a contractual change, it'd be a short-term change. Again, thinking back to the brain and how the brain doesn't operate on stress very well, making sure people have enough room to bring their baseline down again, and they can operate better from there. And that can be done via techniques. So we just talked a bit about breaks in the day. Sometimes I have an app called Pomodoro, if you've heard of that. It's just a 25-minute timer. So you do a task for 25 minutes, then you have a 5-minute break. And this repeats, then it goes to a 25-minute break. So it's kind of training your brain really to see that break coming is another good way.
I remember reading a study about breaks. I think it was Harvard Business Review, talking about how there was an engineering company and, you know, they were trying to get cross-pollination within the business of ideas and things. It wasn't really happening. And they had someone, I think it was an intern or somebody, came along and basically just bought some biscuits to have with the tea. So it was one of these companies where there was an 11 o'clock break, but people just kind of, you know, either weren't using it or whatever. But just the fact there was like some other reason to go and, you know, get a biscuit and have a cup of tea or whatever meant that people kind of hung around a little bit more.
Yeah.
And they found that people were communicating more internally in the business. They were, you know, obviously discussing what projects they're working on, a bit more, you know, collaboration. And what they found that as soon as the, you know, the person who's buying the biscuits and organising that, you know, finished their internship and moved on, was that over time just kind of drifted away again.
Interesting.
So it's back to that point about having those rhythms to manage stress, isn't it, within the business? And, you know, I guess we're probably, I'm just thinking here, we don't have a set, you know, we're actually tell everyone to go and do things, different times almost suits the business in a way. But
I think there's a lot of kind of self-care techniques that people can do, and that's a great way to manage stress. And I think sometimes people find every excuse in the world to not do self-care because it can take more time, and you think, well, the time I go to the gym or go for a run, I could have done these tasks, but actually we're probably not going to perform as well by continuing. And I had a great quote that I use when I present, and it states, if you don't take time for your wellness, you'll be forced to take time for your illness. So just not making those slots in the day to make sure that you stay well often will mean accumulatively you might need a big time being signed off work to actually get yourself better again.
And that's where I think it's like what we were talking about before, is it the new smoking stress?
Yes, sitting is the new smoking.
Sitting is the new smoking, yeah. And just kind of this whole, like, I suppose what I'm trying to get out there is that it sort of sits under the surface for a long time, doesn't it? Yes. You think you're okay because you're sitting there kind of just working at your desk doing things, and maybe it's you're getting home, you're staying in the office 15 minutes later, 20 minutes later, whatever, or you think you can handle it, or you can absorb it, you can do all of this. And I guess, you know, I'm as guilty as anyone. It's just like, you know, broad shoulders, crack on type of thing. I suppose that's the interesting kind of balance for me, is to say, well, where is that point where you think, actually, this is something that I need some help with? Maybe it's kind of informal support. It's just going for a beer with someone after work, or a glass of wine or something, or going for a run with somebody else, or whatever that is. And I suppose, just to sort of relay another story, and I'll try and keep this as confidential as I can, but it's I remember being in a networking group years ago with some pretty senior people, and we were talking about, you know, just different issues affecting the business. And there's probably about 10 people in the room. And I said, well, why don't we talk about stress? And at the time, I wasn't particularly stressed myself, because I'd been through this episode before, which I talked about earlier. I'd kind of figured out, okay, this is what makes me kind of get stressed, and I'd learned to deal with it. But it was really interesting just to see in the room the kind of physiological reaction of people. You know, people, if you took them out of that context and put them in their businesses, they would be board level people who probably wouldn't react like that in a workplace. But, you know, some people were having physiological reactions. It was just really, I was surprised that nearly everybody in the room was dealing with serious levels of stress, which was basically, you know, manifesting itself in either overeating, drinking too much, just And it was really kind of shocked me, really. I thought, why are we not talking about this more?
Mm-hmm. When it's such a common thing as well. And I think coming back to what you said about, you generally do okay, and people generally just carry these things all right and until they maybe talk about it and realise the impact. And I heard another good quote which I wanted to share, which is just because someone carries it well doesn't mean that it's not heavy. And again, you might not know that there's things going on inside of you because there can be, like they say, blood pressure is a silent killer. It's still a heavy strain on your body. And we don't always know, but I think it's good to have a bit of an indication. And we call this a stress signature. So what is it for you that indicates that I might be getting stressed? Yeah. And I know for me, I remember once watching an advert on telly and it was about chips, oven chips, I think. And there was a soft song in the background. And I remember just weeping and thinking, Lisa, why are you crying over chips? And I think sometimes you think, why am I getting so emotional? Why am I getting so tearful? And that's my stress signature. I will start to get overly emotional on things that you wouldn't usually trigger me at all.
See, I get that. And we've talked not about chips,
Here we go.
But we talked about this before. I didn't cry for about 25 years.
Yeah.
And I still, I'm not I'm not blubbering into my pillow every night at all.
Not anymore.
But not anymore after the therapy.
Yeah.
But it's things like cool runnings. Like every time when that bobsleigh, when that sled comes off, there's something about that. It's like the injustice of it that gets me. Or even films now, I find that I get a much, it's just, kind of a bit of dust in the room sort of thing going on. But yeah, I guess that's probably some sort of repressed something or other that I need to work through. But it could actually be a sign of stress, just latent stress.
Yeah, it could be. It could be something suppressed and it's just, like you say, squeezing itself out. But I think with anything with stress, and I think you mentioned earlier, what is that tipping point? How do we know then if it's kind of like a silent, it creeps up on us? How do we know when it's really impacting? And one of the key things is the impact on your functioning. So even with stress and even with things that we deal with in life, we should roughly be able to function okay still with the things that we need to do. Now, when we can't function, that means the stress has become chronic or we're hitting somewhere, called burnout, where we're no longer being able to function, having a conversation, being able to be in healthy relationships, don't want to do pleasurable activities anymore, not sleeping anymore, don't want to cook, don't want to get out of bed often as well. And that's where you're hitting that state of burnout. And that's where it's really important then to take breaks because your body is saying, I'm not coping. I can't do what I need to do.
So that's almost like the natural, if you're finding that kind of it's like an apathy almost.
Apathy is a huge thing. So I remember when I was going around the country presenting and driving, and we used to evaluate every session. And I remember going through a phase of not wanting to give them out, didn't care what the feedback was. And I thought, that's not me. And I told my boss at the time, I said, do you know what? I don't care. I'm not even giving out these evaluations. And he said apathy is the first sign of depression, can be one of the very early indicators of depression. If you're stressed, you're tired, it's going to manifest in things like depression, anxiety. And so we set a kind of a schedule in place, like I had to be home by 7 p.m. and so on. And it was really good. So I think sometimes you've got to just catch yourself. And you don't want to get to burnout. You want to get there way before. So that's why it's really important to know what your stress signature is. What do I need to step back with? Where do I need to create this space? Because I'm going to get ill and then I'm going to be forced.
And is there like a useful exercise that people listening could actually do to evaluate their stress? Is it just as simple as sitting down with a sheet of paper and just being reflective and writing down? Or
do you know what I would do? There's actually like a bit of an exercise called the stress bucket. So I would actually get people to draw on a sheet of paper a bucket and write down everything in their life that has the potential or is causing them stress. So it could be something that actually brings you a lot of joy. It could be the children, but there also could be a source of stress right now because of what's going on in their lives. And just kind of listing, we don't often sit down and list, what are my stressors? What are things that are potentially going to cause me stress? And then I do another little box saying healthy coping mechanisms and unhelpful. So having a look at what am I doing that's not serving me right now? What am I doing well that I need to do more of? And I think that's a really good way. Another way we choose with my patients is to say, right, if I want my mental health to get really bad, what have I got to do?
Right, okay.
And it's things like I've got to make sure I don't exercise, make sure I eat a lot of rubbish, make sure that I don't see my friends. And then often we look and think, I'm not doing any of those things right now. So we can kind of see where it's going and then plan to do the complete opposite. Right, I need to move, I need to connect to people, I need to make sure I do things I enjoy. So a couple of things there that can be quite good to highlight and make us aware of what's going on.
And so, okay. And do we, in terms of involving other people, so back to my, networking group here, it was a bit of a chance. It wasn't something that as a group of blokes you'd be sitting there saying, let's have a chat about this, over a coffee or something. It just happened to come out of the conversation. And this was probably 8 years ago or so. So even then it was not something that was really spoken about in terms of, you know, it took a little bit of trust still to do. I guess, are you seeing the attitudes towards stress are changing within the sort of business world?
I think it's slowly changing. I think people are talking about it more and realising actually what's going to happen if we don't address stress or we don't address people's reaction to that. But I think you're right, there is like a bit of a stigma attached to putting your hand up and saying, hey, I'm struggling, or I'm not doing too well, or this is getting too heavy to hold. And there's also something called toxic positivity in the office. Sometimes we can glorify overworking. If I'm sending an email at midnight, oh, look at them, they're working so hard. But actually that's really detrimental to their health. And is there a pressure then for that person to also be seen working that way? So it can be really damaging and not actually positive at all.
So I guess the other thing, like we've talked about kind of like what is stress and what can trigger stress, and you know that a bit about the stress signature in terms of, you know, kind of identifying for yourself and maybe using the stress bucket.
Yeah.
to, you know, I'm learning to kind of work through all that, which I think, you know, hopefully people are taking away from that thing. That's actually something really practical we can do. Talking to other people around you, you know, kind of those things. At what point is it, and this is kind of, you know, where a lot of what we talked about, you can manage yourself. So it's all about kind of identifying what's causes the impact for you, and putting things in place to mitigate those or alleviate things.
Yeah, I think, again, coming back to how people are functioning and bearing in mind that out of stress comes illness. So particularly anxiety and depression are really common mental health problems that come out of stress. And I think if people are starting to struggle with things like, it can be something like their worries, they're always thinking, what if? If you're thinking, what if, the brain doesn't know if that's a future worry or if it's happening now. So the anxiety response will kick off in the now. Then people will have a physiological reaction and they'll behave in accordance with that. Then they'll go back to their thoughts, I'm not performing well, what if I lose my job? And they get into a bit of a cycle, and people can get stuck in that cycle. Very similar with low mood. So if people are getting depressed, like you say about my apathy, maybe then I can't be bothered to get up in the morning, maybe then I phone in sick, maybe then I think, oh, I'm rubbish, not very good, and then my body reacts to that and so on, and I get into a bit of a lethargic cycle, and people can stay stuck in those. So sometimes it's really good to have a professional, whether that's a therapist. A lot of employees have EAP, Employee Assistance Program, which is free therapy, or one of the evidence-based treatments for anxiety and depression in particular is cognitive behavioural therapy, where people can look at what cycles have you got into, then how can we look at changing some of those things, challenging thoughts, challenging behaviours. So I think if people are thinking, I'm actually stuck in this, I can't stop worrying, or I'm feeling anxious all the time, like you said, you've been physically sick, that's a huge physiological response. Or why am I demotivated? Why don't I want to answer my friends' messages anymore or meet anybody? That could be getting into low mood cycles there. Having a therapist kind of explore some of those patterns with you can be really beneficial. Sometimes we function in the way that we've always functioned, and we need someone else to look in and go, hey, did you know you could do it this way? Yeah. We've no idea there was another way to do it because we've always done it as we do ourselves. You know, so it can be really helpful.
Excellent. Well, I think that's probably draws a good line under where we've got to. We covered quite a big range of topics there. And I really appreciate you coming in. Like, I've always appreciated our chats about this this topic. They're you know, it's always really good to be able to, you know, have good mental health, isn't it? And we're living in a much more kind of pressurized world where increasingly that, you know, takes its toll on our mental health. So, and I think in a business setting, that's true. You know, if you think what we've come through in terms of, you know, a lot of business owners from COVID to, you know, inflation, all those kind of cost of living, all of that. It's like it's taken a toll on everybody. So, yeah, I would love to have you back at some point.
I'd love to come back. It's been a pleasure to come and talk to you.
There's a couple of other topics we want to cover, but I think for now, this has been the SME Growth Podcast. Thanks a lot for listening. We hope you found this episode interesting and useful, and you've been able to take something away from it that really helps your mental health, or perhaps someone you know. So if you know someone who would benefit from this podcast, we'd love you to like and share it and repost it wherever you get your podcast from. So thanks again for listening to the SME podcast, and hope you have a great week of mental health ahead of you.